Hey guys, got a 15-minute game against somebody rated 800 exactly. So I've got the black pieces. I'm going to talk through my process. Had somebody comment today that they appreciate the live games and actually hearing my thought process that I go through. Okay, so we've got the Ruy Lopez, the Spanish game. Okay, so I'm going to kick the bishop. If takes, I recapture with the d pawn. That actually hangs this pawn, yep. But now I think queen there, knight has to retreat and I get a free pawn. Unless white chooses to defend the knight. I can also hit the knight with this as well. That also looks okay. Let's bring the bishop out first and then maybe the queen, knight. I want to get ready to castle. There is a fly buzzing around the room, in case you picked that up. Okay, they've moved the f-pawn. And what do we know about the f-pawn? Okay, queen there, check, is an option. That will pretty much force g3. Okay. But if I take the knight first and pawn recaptures, then I give check. King's in check. There's no pawn on here. Then so let's try that. We'll double up the pawns. Really opening up the king side now. And now I think queen here, check. There's no way to block, so it's either the king has to move or this pawn is pushed. If the pawn is pushed, I get these two pawns, probably. So check there. If the king moves to here, I have bishop g4, okay. So I have another check, or two other checks. No, that's not viable, not doing that one. Or I can simply grab the pawn. I think it makes sense to grab the pawn. So if I check, for example, here, white has queen blocking. So I think we'll do that first. Then I even have bishop coming out here, defended by the queen, attacking the white's queen. White's queen only has one square. Then there's a free pawn. Let's see what white chooses to do. Okay, so now I can give check a couple of ways, or I can just grab the pawn. I can also check here. I think grabbing the pawn is okay. If the queen goes there, we can just trade off queens. White's king's already been forced to move. Okay, I think we need to trade, or I can't really recapture with development. That's the problem with that. And I can't move the queen. So it's either trade off or defend my queen. I don't really want to defend it with the f-pawn, so I'm going to trade off, get castled, and settle in. Going to have my rook on f8. White's king is also on the f-file. So I'm quite happy about that. Pawns are one in my favour at the end of all that. Okay, what's the idea with this knight? Can't go there, there, or there. So I'm just going to go ahead and castle. My bishop is controlling some light squares as well. Alright, now, clearly I want to engage my rooks. So it's a question, rook f to e8 now, or should I develop my bishop? Well, maybe actually the best place for my bishop is here. So I'm going to put my pawns on dark squares, I think, yeah. Get my pawns on dark squares, leave the light squares open for my bishop, and attack the g2 pawn, which is, will then be pinned in a sense, with the rook behind it. nothing to gain and everything to lose, points-wise. White's big problem is now the king is not castled, so it's going to be slow to get these rooks out. He should really be looking at developing his bishop in order to unleash this rook, anyway. Okay, I'm going to carry on with my plan. Idea of a pawn push with a discovered attack on the rook. The pawn push can come with a threat, so if he pushes there, for example, I could win the pawn. Okay. Now let's centralize one rook. Plan to centralize the other. Right, so that's got out of that challenge. I have a check if I need it. Also attacking that pawn. I have to be concerned about potential trap. If I go there, king goes here, I can give check with the bishop on these light squares, and king can go here, and then the knight can retreat. If I check, pawn pushes, no, that's not an option, he has to get out of check. Or do I push this and then give check, so that the king cannot approach the pawn? I think that makes sense. Yeah, and if rook trades, I'll just pre-move the recapture. So now I have an active rook, but my opponent does not. Now I can give check here. So king cannot go to these squares, would have to go there to save the pawn. Right, and then... then what? He's done quite a good job of simplifying the game so far. Let's give check and see what happens. Can't go here or here, so it has to go there to defend this pawn. So that's what we're expecting. Okay, well played. Now here, with the idea of going there with a fork. Will my opponent spot that? 800 rated. They may not. The king can't proceed that way. His just experience tells me that this... Okay, and that's actually even better, because now I get the rook. Check, completely forcing move. White does technically have mate in one, but can't play it when they're in check. Okay, so we're up the exchange, and now we're getting into a nicer ending. So pawns on dark squares, I think, at this point. White has a reasonably defensible structure here. I'm just going to push this pawn. At least I own this open e-file. That's good. It means the king cannot stray onto there. Right, this is okay. Just move another pawn onto a dark square. Okay, knight's put itself in a place where I can capture. And if I do, and c retakes, then white's going to have two pawns, both on light squares, right? And then if I play rook d8, how can white defend either of those pawns? I think this makes sense. Simplify. Now rook to d8. I don't think that pawn can be saved in any way. No, can't. Okay, well, that's a shame. Would have been nice to finish the game off, but I think at this point, look at all these pawns on dark squares. That means that all of these squares here are out of bounds to white's remaining bishop. Okay, and he was going to lose at least one pawn here. Even if king there, yeah, it's definitely a lost position. So perfectly reasonable, I think, to resign at that point. But there you go. Let's do a quick review. If you're 800, what should you be looking out for? Okay, so normal Spanish game, the Ruy Lopez. Kick the bishop, takes, and giving up this pawn. I don't know if queen e7 is a normal move. I don't really play the Spanish very much. But and here we go. Yeah, I'm moving the f-pawn, definitely weakening here. What other options were there? Is queen there an option? Then if bishop takes, queen takes with check. It's a bit radical. I think actually d4 would have been certainly preferable to f4 at this stage. And then we get double pawns, and now check, and now I win the pawn back. Okay, so material is equal. Spite attack doesn't mean anything, and this is a forced exchange, recapturing of the knight. Maybe actually, I think possibly recapturing with the king at this point would have been better, keeping the knight more central, more forward on the board, and also then opening up the back rank to some degree. Might have been a better move, but now I just proceed to castle. And now I'm getting my pawns onto dark squares because I have a light squared bishop, my opponent has a dark squared bishop. Okay. Later on in the game, if we are, it can also be useful to put your pawns onto the opposite colour squares to the bishop that your opponent has, if he only has one bishop, in order to make them invisible to the bishop and proceed towards promotion. Okay. King moves forward, occupy the open file, and now I'm not concerned about rook capture, because if white initiates the capture, I get the rook still on e8, so I get to control the open file. Nobody really wants to initiate this exchange. In fact, it's not so bad for me because the king would have to retreat. But this pawn push was useful, takes a couple of squares away from the dark squared bishop, and also takes away a couple of squares from the king. Takes, I'm happy about that. Now I go in with check, and the king has only one square to defend the pawn. Now the knight reroutes. I'm looking at one fork here. This is basic tactics. I spy with my little eye something beginning with F. And there we go, and the rook falls. And now, pretty obvious, that exchange forces pawns onto light squares, and that's the end of the game. So there you go, just a couple of loose moves by white. I think white played a decent game. I think the biggest error was this rook move here, because it just walked into the fork. You know, it seems as though the knight's pinned because rook takes rook as mate, but it doesn't matter. If a move can be played with check, then nothing else counts. It's all over. He cannot play this move if he's in check. Okay, so simple tactics. You need to practice these and spot the patterns over and over. When there's a knight lurking here, right? The knight's on a dark square, the king's on a dark square. You don't put your rook on a dark square, all right? Unless you've checked and double checked for safety. Because king and rook, any two pieces that are 2 squares apart in line, falling straight for a knight fork. Okay, there you go. Interesting little game. Hope it's been useful and interesting for you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.